Hello, everyone. Welcome. This week we talk about GDP. We really are getting into our more macroeconomic centric concepts. And this week we focus, of course, in chapter 3 on GDP. So, this activity here, we are going to calculate nominal GDP, real GDP, and then use the GDP deflator with practice data and apply our GDP formula to real data from Fred. As a reminder, Fred is our federal data reserve. We use this just for any kind of macroeconomic concept or any other concept. It's a great free resource to be able to find any kind of macro data. So things like GDP on here, this is kind of what we'll be using. As a reminder, GDP is our gross domestic product. It's kind of that measurement of how domestic product within the US or how to measure growth domestically. So one of the reasons why, as a reminder too, that we do use a deflator or we look at nominal versus real, is so that we can make a comparison across time. We want to be able to account for things like inflation and purchasing power. And because of that, that's what a deflator helps us do. We are using a deflator kind of as a leveling tool so that we can then compare different years using one specific form of the dollar. So in this activity, once again, we are going to use Excel. So please either open that up on your browser or if you have it on your desktop, use it on there. As well, you could also use Google Sheets for this, as always. But I always recommend that you do um, use the web. Use either web browser, Excel, or your. All right, so the goal of today is to be able to do the following. We are going to do some calculations together, nominal GDP deflator, real GDP. We are going to create a pie graph, so we are going to explore another different form of graphing in Excel utilizing a table, and we're going to look at the composition of GDP. And then we're also going to download some data from Fred together and create like a time series where we're going to track GDP over time. So our goal is to be able to create something like this also in Excel. So we're going to open a new sheet. As a reminder, the way it functions in Excel, each of these cells, they have both a row and a column, and each individual cell has its own name, and we utilize those to be able to create different functions. And then we can use that to graph, and we can use that to make tables, and we can use that to do math for us. So in our first sheet, what we're going to do is we're going to call this, and you can easily change the name if you double click on something and write whatever you want in there. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm going to call this example. And so here we have our blank sheet. We're going to do the following. So in the table is a breakdown of GDP along with breakdowns for each part of GDP. Remember, when GDP is looked at from a demand side, the following its breakdown is consumption, C, investment, I, G for government spending, X for exports, and M for imports. And what we do with imports versus exports is we do something called the difference between them, or we take the net exports and we look at the value between those things in order to see whether or not we're losing money. Are we importing too much, or are we gaining money? Are we exporting more than we are importing? So in this case, I have some rounded numbers from 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. We can very easily do a couple different things. We can either copy and paste this whole table in, or we can type it all out. If you want to copy and paste it, all you have to do is right click on it, or you can do Control C on your keyboard, click over here, Control V, and it will paste it for you. There are a few things once you get this, and also as a reminder, these labels up at the top are just supposed to indicate what row and column things should be in case when we start calling for them, you get a little bit confused. You might notice a couple different patterns right at the top. You might see that consumption is increasing. We're also seeing that investment increases. We are seeing a little bit of an increase. Um, We are seeing increase in government spending. We're seeing fluctuations where it's increasing in most everything over time. And what this might, and part of the reason why we want to be able to use a GDP deflator is say, is this increase in GDP actually a growth in the economy? Or is this really just an increase due to inflation? And do our numbers just look different because the value of our dollar has changed substantially over time? So now that we have that table, we want to fill in our net exports. So remember, we want to do this math. The easiest way we can do this is we use that enter. Remember, that creates an equation, and that makes it so we can call towards things. And we are going to do B5, which is those are our exports, and we are just going to subtract our exports from our imports, right? X minus M, and we'll see. And then we can also easily just drag this over, and you can just check to make sure everything is correct when you see our equation in the corner. So it should look something like this. We can see over time, as well as other aspects of our economy are growing, we are also seeing this too, where our net exports is becoming more negative and we have more of what could be assumed to be some kind of debt, right? If this difference between these two things is negative, that means that our imports are greater than our exports. So we're spending more money than we are making. The next thing we want to do is calculate our nominal GDP. So our nominal GDP is pretty simple. Our nominal GDP, and we can just add that on to our table. Our nominal GDP, remember, that's the one where we don't account for anything. That's kind of just all our basic numbers added up together. The way we want to do this is we just want to add all our things in our column together. Remember, we're going to skip over X and M because we've already accounted for those in our net exports. And then we'll press enter, and then we'll use this little green guy again and drag it on over, and that'll give us our whole table. So we can see just right off the bat, we can see that our nominal GDP is increasing over time. The next thing we want to be able to do is then to do our GDP deflator. So in this case, we are going to do a new line again. And in this one, remember to calculate our GDP deflator, we need our nominal and our real GDP. And then we multiply it by 100 so we can get that percent interpretation. But since we don't have real GDP, we're going to do something instead. We're going to use 2023, so 2023 as what we call our base year, and we're going to do that. So we're going to define 2023 as our base year, so that's our 100, right? That is the year we are going to use as a comparison. That's the dollar amount we're going to use as a comparison for all other years. So in this case, for 2024, then we'd assume that some kind of price growth, we'll say maybe 4% each year. Well, we're going to account for this in clarification. So we're going to account for any kind of inflation that's going on. We're just going to use 4%. And that 4% is assuming some kind of growth for this exercise. It's not an actual calculation from real GDP, but we're using that instead. So we're saying that over time, our dollar amount has increased. So if we go back a year, so if our first year is our 100, if we go back a year, that means, and remember, there needs to be no blanks, just in, we're going to have 96% of that dollar amount. So we can kind of think about this as like a full dollar, right? If we have the year before, our dollar is not going to be at our 100%. And the year after, it gets a little bit bigger. And the year after that, it gets bigger. If you want to do something different here and you just want to write around 08, that's totally fine. But I'm going to use the 1.816, so it might look a little bit different with your numbers. If you get this on accident, you need to just change the numbers. So on here, remember each little cell itself has its own, what you could call identity. And in this case, when you want to do our identities, you can go down to home and you can click down this little cursor bar, and you'll see what each kind of identity, right? We could call this a number, a currency, accounting, general, specific. Right now, we're just going to do general, nothing crazy about it. And if you have a percent and it kind of comes up crazy, it's got a bunch of extra zeros, it's probably because you need to change its identity back to just a normal thing. The reasons why we're going to see this too, right? And we say it right here, is because for years after our base year, so our base year again, if we want to highlight it maybe just so we remember that we're using this is our base year. Anything after that 2023, there are higher average prices. So we had inflation following those years. The reason why anything prior to it is less than that 100 is the deflation. Now we can then calculate our real GDP. Our real GDP is where we end up taking that nominal GDP and we take our deflator and we do some division. So the easiest way to do this then is to use this equation. So the way this equation works, right, is we take our nominal, we divide by that GDP deflator, and then we multiply out. And then we can drag that over to enter. The reason why this looks a little crazy is it needs some more space. Oh, that's because it's calling to the wrong thing. Two. So if it does not call to the right cells at first, we are going to make sure it does. All right. Now it's calling to the right cell. Right. And if we did everything correctly, where we have our equation, right? We have our nominal, we're dividing by our deflator, and then we're multiplying by 100. If we did this correctly, that means that whatever our base year is, our nominal should match our real. Right, so that's our table, right? We can either do this by hand, or we can do it on Excel, whatever you are most comfortable with, but that is the basic breakdown of what we're looking at. Remember, the biggest thing to remember here is that when we are looking at something like this, what we are trying to identify is inflation and kind of use one singular year as a base for comparison. So we want to look if there's deflation or there's inflation. The next thing we're going to do is calculate a share of GDP. The way we're going to do this is we're going to use a pie chart. So we're going to use this nice table here and we're going to copy it over again. With this next one, it might look a little weird because we have these percents. But remember, in an economy where we end up importing more than we export, we're going to have that negative and it's kind of going to take away from our GDP, right? We're spending more than we're making in that sense, and we're kind of in that negative. So the reason why we're going to do this, though, it makes it pretty easy. What we're going to do is we can take a singular year here. We can highlight our components. We could pick any year. It might be easiest too to highlight the ones together. Then we're going to go to this little pie chart here and we can click on pie chart. So we do that a little bit slower. So what we want to do is we want to measure each component of GDP in the year 2022. What you can do is you can highlight both of these. In highlighting both these columns, we're going to identify each of these as a title or an indicator and each of these as the value given to it. So if we go into insert and we go down to our charts, what we'll notice, we have a bunch of recommended ones. It might even end up recommending a pie chart to you. If it does that, use that one. If it doesn't, then you can go into the insert pie or donut chart. If you want to do it as a donut, you can do it as a donut. Donuts are kind of the exact same thing as pie chart, but you can use something in the center to kind of help identify the points. We want to do this 2D pie chart here. We click on that. Now we have our pie chart. As always, with a chart, the one thing we want to make sure we are absolutely doing is naming our chart. This one we want to name our chart. We want to call it GDP 2022 for a more simplistic label. If you want to call it breakdown of GDP 2022, composition of US GDP, using example data, you can copy this over to, in this one, we did 2022. You can do this exact same thing with any of these columns. And what we'll see is it'll give values to each of them. In this case, I just added a little bit of other useful operations. The last thing I want us to be able to do together is I want us to be able to create a time series. And a time series is we would look at one variable over time. So our two variables on our axes is time and then whatever component we're looking at. In this case, I want us to look at GDP. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to open up Fred. Fred's going to look something like this again. We're going to look at GDP. And the thing we're going to do, let's just look at GDP over the past 10 years. That way, we're not looking at anything too crazy. But what we want to do is we want to look at the data. And I'm going to edit this graph. And so instead of looking at quarters, so there's 4 quarters in a year, a grouping of 3 months, what we want to look at instead is something like an annual. So we only have a certain amount of points. So if we look at annual data, that means that it's only going to be once a year. So we're only going to deal with about 10 points. So we want to save that. This looks great. Now that's exactly what we want, right? So what we're going to do next is we're going to go to download and we're going to download Excel file. You can also download this if you want to personally as an image itself. As a PowerPoint graph, those let you be a little bit more. You can play around with it a little bit more, or as a CSV file, but we really want that Excel file. Easiest thing you can do is you can actually just open that right up, and we can edit the data from how it is. So anytime you download data from any place, if it's good data, it should have a few different things. It'll have this kind of opening page that says README, and this is an indication of all the background information for your data. So it tells us we downloaded this as Fred observations. This is from the Federal Reserve. It gives us a link to the data. It gives us a link to a help. In case there are any issues you notice an inconsistency, you can always reach out to a lot of these platforms and they'll fix it, help you explain things. It gives you a copyright, and then something that's super important, it tells you when you download this data. It also gives you your variable list. We only did one variable. We have GDP, gross domestic product. It tells us what we downloaded it in, billions of dollars. It's annual data. It's seasonally adjusted, so that means that it's smoothed out, which means they kind of took an average of the 4 quarters or any seasonal data, or monthly data, or whatever they had, and they took the average of that. And so that gives us that smoother trend. If we click over to the next thing, this is where we see our actual information. So in this case, we can see, and we want to make sure we enable editing too, a couple different things. We're going to see our observation date. That's indicating us when that each variable was occurred, right? So in this case, we can see it's 0101, beginning of the year. So we have 2015 to 2024. We don't have 2025 data yet. We'll go to soon, hopefully. And then we have our GDP in billions of dollars. We can see that it's going up all the time. If we want to create our trend graph, our time trend, we can do that super easily. It looks pretty similar to what we've done before with kind of like budget constraints and supply and demand. But in this time, we are going to go to, if you go to recommended charts, it might show you something like this. That's great. We want something like this. We either want something like a scatter or we want something like a line. In this case, I would like to show all the points, so I'm actually going to use a scatter. I'm going to use a line with markers already. In this case, let's go with just a regular line with markers. We're only looking at one thing. Now, so this is showing us, right, our GDP trends. So we can see GDP over time. We have all our different markers. We can say this is GDP, just like we have here. we can actually copy this value over and we can name this here, right? And then we tell this is data from 2015 to 2024. And then we have a time series. There are a couple other things we can do with this as well, but we'll get to those a little bit later. We just want to make sure we can understand when we're plotting something like this. See, we have our dollar here, and we might want to actually add, we can add labels on the data, but we might want to add our axes, right? So this on this side is billions of dollars, right? This isn't just thousands, this is billions. Oops. This over here on this side is our dates. And there we have a graph. Other than that, that is a breakthrough of kind of what GDP is looking like for us. We learned a little bit about pie charts. We learned a little bit about our data, right? If we wanted to download more data, we could do an even more extensive version of this. This is also available to you on Moodle if you would like to take a look. You are more than welcome to. Otherwise, you are all set. Have a good rest of your day. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, and have a good one.